Welcome everybody to another episode of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. I have as my guest today, Hugh Turley. Hi, Hugh. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me to be in your program.
I'm just absolutely thrilled to interview you. I finished your book last night, The Martyrdom of Thomas Merton, an investigation. And I think I emailed you 48 hours ago when I was in the middle of the book, and I said, I want to talk to you about this right away. Thank you for writing the book that a lot of us have been, I think, waiting for a long time.
Let me ask you a question. How did you find out about the book? Because we're not really publicized or advertised.
I found out about your book through Charlie McCarthy's email list.
Okay.
Do you know Charles McCarthy? He's a priest.
Yes, I do know him.
I heard about it that way, and then I think. Sorry?
A Notre Dame priest.
Yeah, he was the one at Notre Dame who left in '68, the year that Thomas Merton died. And he actually gave it an endorsement and said he had read it and he felt it was a well-researched book. And so I picked it up, and I actually asked Jim Forrest about it as well. And he had a comment for me, but I think I'm going to have him on the show hopefully later in the year, so he'll have a chance to say his piece about it. But Father McCarthy,
he has emailed me, but he's been pretty tight-lipped about it.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, this book is, for those of you listening, Thomas Merton. I'm going to try, actually, I think before I put this podcast out, I'm going to do a whole separate episode, maybe 30 minutes, on sharing with people some of the anti-war writings of Thomas Merton so that they can understand why he might have been targeted for assassination. So we don't have to go too much into his background, but he was a monk, lived from 1915 to 1968. He went to Columbia University, converted to Catholicism at the age of 23. In his mid-20s, he became a monk, and he wrote The Seven-Story Mountain, which is a spiritual classic published in 1948. So everybody knew about him by 1948 in the Catholic world, and by the 1960s, he had become very outspoken about writing about anti-war, mass societies, mass media, writing about all of this from a spiritual perspective. Supposedly he died in Bangkok from being electrocuted by a fan. That's what we've always been told. But Hugh,
one of the many stories.
Right. So
I think Tim Douglas one time quoted Andrew Young saying that he was electrocuted by a hairdryer while he was in the bathtub.
Right. And then there was the story that he was in the bathtub and someone the fan fell into the bathtub. So much disinformation out there. It's always been a bizarre story, and the New York Times or something called it like, oh, it's just a freak accident. But that was the year, April 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated. June 5th, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And this is following the My Lai massacre took place earlier that year. And on December 10th, Thomas Merton mysteriously was electrocuted, supposedly. So it's always been a bizarre story. There's never been a lot of information out there about it. How did you get interested? Can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got interested in investigating this?
Well, my background is I live near Washington, D.C., and there was a mysterious death here in 1993. The Deputy White House Counsel in the Clinton administration, Vincent W. Foster, was found dead in a park. And I remember reading the paper the next morning, and it said that the body was found by an anonymous passerby. And I just thought, that's strange. That's a very important person because they're a witness. I mean, they saw the body, they were at the scene. What they saw is very important. I said, how could they just be anonymous? That doesn't make sense to me. But I didn't act on it. I just sort of put that away. And then it was a year later when, and I'm sure some of the viewers will remember the O.J. Simpson case and the murders there. And on that case, it was on the news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and all of the facts and all of the details. He drove a white Ford Bronco. I wondered, well, what kind of car did the White House counsel Vincent Foster drive? They never told us that. They never told us who found the body. And I thought, we know who found Nicole Simpson's body, so why don't we know who found Vincent Foster's body? And it puzzled me. And I couldn't stand the radio, all this OJ stuff all the time, and I wanted to know more about this other death that I was told nothing about. So I was driving near the crime scene, which was a park, and I thought I'd just drop in and take a look around. I've never been to a crime scene before. I thought, let me see where this guy died. And when I went into the woods, I met a media critic there named Reed Irvine, who's a very fine man. And I was just bumped into him in the woods, and I asked him if he knew where the body was found, and he said that there were 2 body sites. I said, you gotta be kidding. He said, it's a year later now. And he said, well, some people say it was found over here, some people say it was found over there. But he said, come to my office the next day, and he would give me the police report as it was. So I went there and I started reading, and I got more interested, and then I started reading all the documents, and I became an expert on the case. And eventually I assisted an attorney and his client, Patrick Knowlton, who was a grand jury witness in the case. And we ended up adding 20 pages to the official report. The U.S. Court of Appeals ordered our evidence included in the report. And that was, that report, by the way, was written by Brett Kavanaugh. Cover-up report. Anyway, we have a website, if anyone wants to look at it, it's called FBICoverup.com.
Okay.
Everything I've ever done in that case is there. And my friends, John Clark, Patrick's attorney, and Patrick Knowlton, we all still keep in touch. But my friends told me, you know, Turley, you should look into Merton's death too. We always thought it was a little suspicious that he died the same year as Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And by this point, I'd learned that the media doesn't tell us the truth, and that they lie, and that they cover up murders, and that the government murders people. I'd learned quite a bit by this point. So I thought, well, yeah, I should look into that Merton thing, but I never did. And then I was at the Dominican House of Studies in the Washington one day. I was in the choir stall there praying, and I found a Merton book there. Picked it up, and I started to read about Thomas Merton, and I read his biography. I read books by him, and I became very interested in the man. And then I decided I finally was going to look into his death, and I started the process, which is really to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the beginning and get the original key documents. And that's what I did. And I was surprised that no one had ever done this before. No one ever looked into anything about it.
This is what I appreciate about your book. It's a great investigation. You're not a professional investigator or a professional journalist, although you did write a column for a long time.
I'm not a paid professional investigator, and that would be a professional investigator would be a paid person. I'm not paid to do this research that I did, and I'm just a truth seeker, and I'm curious about the truth, and I love the truth. I studied philosophy in college, and I just like to know the truth about things, because in the end, I think that it brings us closer to God, who is the source of truth. And the closer we get to the truth, the closer we move towards God. And of course, I think Thomas Aquinas wrote, when we believe things that are false, we do not believe in God, because God doesn't present us with lies. So when you believe lies, you're moving in the other direction. So that's part of my love of the truth. And there's a joy in finding the truth about things. It can be disturbing, because the truth is sometimes disturbing, but at the same time, it's liberating. And that's what's important.
Yes. Christ said the truth. He was the truth, and the truth would set us free, of course.
Yeah, that's true.
So you are a Catholic then. I was going to ask you that as well.
Yeah. Well, actually, that was the thing that the big benefit of the whole thing, because when I looked into the case of Vincent Foster with my friends, it brought us back into the church. And Patrick Knowlton, the key witness, and I were both Catholic, and we ended up. Well, I go to Mass daily now. That's what I got out of my time spent looking for the truth. Is it got me to receive the Eucharist every day, and to pray daily, and to grow closer to God. Now, the bad guys, like Brett Kavanaugh, is one of the bad guys who's part of an ongoing cover-up of a murder. He got to be in the Supreme Court.
The Vince Foster murder is what you're talking
yeah,
about.
exactly.
Okay.
So Brett's on the Supreme Court. I'm going to daily mass. Who do you think won?
Right. Well, good. I'm glad. I mean, I didn't need to know that you were a Catholic to interview you, but that's nice to know that you bring that to the table.
Well, that's the most important thing, and that's the ultimate fruit of my labor, is that it brings me closer to God. And I would hope that as we can share the truth with others, we can help bring other people closer to God, because the world is a fallen world, and there's a lot of falsity in the world and a lot of things that can draw us away from our ultimate end, which is union with God. So that's why it's important.
Yeah, amen. What about your co-author, David Martin? I invited him, but he couldn't be on the program. But is he Catholic? And can you tell us what was his role in the book and what was your role in the book?
Well, David Martin is a Catholic. He's a convert.
Okay.
I'm his godfather.
You are? That's awesome. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, his family was Catholic, and they were always praying for him to convert, and I think I helped pull him over the edge.
Way to go. Way to reel him in.
Yeah, so that's David Martin, and he actually went to college with Vincent Foster, who was the deceased White House counsel.
Right. Okay.
And I think they were a couple of years apart in college, but they played intramural basketball. And when the death happened, and I told you I was curious who found the body, Martin, right off the day one, the story didn't make sense in the newspapers. He didn't believe that he knew this man. He said, I don't believe this guy killed himself. And he wrote a lot about it and did a lot of research. And our paths eventually crossed. And he has written probably more articles on the death of Vincent Foster than anyone.
Yeah, I'll definitely link to that.
Let me give you his website, because it's a great website. He's also a man who loves the truth. Mm-hmm. And his website is called dcdave.com. He goes by the name dcdave.com. And it's a great website. There's a search box on the homepage, and you can put in any name, anything you want. He's written a lot of things about many topics. In fact, he just wrote a book. I'll show it to you if I can show it to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's called The Assassination of James Forrestal. Now, Forrestal was our nation's first Secretary of Defense.
Oh.
And it's another, like Thomas Merton, it's a secret assassination. This is a great book, and it's really selling well, even though it has no advertising. It's just word of mouth. But it's a great story about a really wonderful man who was a very good man, like Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, Thomas Merton. And they kill good men, and they killed James V. Forrestal.
All right, great. Well, I'll definitely link to his website as well. So, yeah, I think it was somebody on Amazon kind of did a review that said this would be a good book if they didn't bring in all the Vince Foster stuff. But I actually really appreciated that, because I think by looking into that case, you guys were better able to pick up on patterns. There are patterns when the CIA does an assassination, and if you've read Jim Douglas's book, if you've looked into the Vince Foster thing, they have ways of doing things.
Right.
And so you guys were able to kind of identify signifiers that might point to, or most likely do point to, a CIA assassination.
Yeah, Martin and I were well qualified for this task, because we had years of experience unraveling a mystery. And we had experienced seeing fake documents before. And in our book, we mentioned some documents that are clearly fake.
Yeah.
And in the Foster case, the FBI falsified witness reports. They would write a report, and it wasn't what the witness said. It was a fake report. So in the Merton case, we found similar examples of fake documents that were just created. And to the casual observer, you're really not ready for that. And you read things and you don't think that something would be fake. And how do you recognize a fake document from a genuine document?
Yeah.
So we had some very wealth of experience that was very useful for the task of unraveling Thomas Merton's murder.
And I think most importantly, too, you did not operate based on the assumption that, well, if there was anything here to have been found, surely our free press would have found it and told us about it. And you knew that that was probably not true. You knew the way that the media works with the CIA. That's the only way they can pull these things off, is to have a complicit media. And you
And
do a great job of exposing that in the book.
well, the other person that knew that very well was Thomas Merton.
Yes.
Knew that the media was the propaganda machine, and he knew that what they published was not true. And he was aware of this. In fact, I was surprised when I read his book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, where just days after the Kennedy assassination, he didn't believe that Oswald killed Kennedy. Right
It's
away.
like he was so ahead of his time, because I think back then people really did still believe Walter Cronkite and the media, and they trusted those media institutions. And it's almost like it's like he was like 50 years ahead of his time in understanding the way propaganda works. And I just wish we could have him here on the podcast to talk about his own.
Well, we can read his works, but another person I was impressed with that way was Thomas Aquinas. I thought to myself, how did he know all these things? How does Merton know that stuff? They seem to know it so early, and I thought, because it took me quite a few years, I didn't really. I guess I was quite a believer in what I was told until I reached the age of 50, maybe 45. But I mean, I was pretty far along by the time I started to figure out that I'd been lied to for so long. It's hard. Yeah, it's hard. Of course, well, part of it is that people want to believe. We are creatures of faith, so it's in part of our human nature is to have faith and believe. But the problem is that we often believe in things that are false.
And I love how you point out in the book that I mentioned this in another podcast I did recently called CIA Catholicism, that in the entrance of their building it says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And you said there's a better quote from Scripture that they should have in their building. Do you remember what that was? It was in the book.
I think it was. I forget what that quote was.
I think it was something
it's from the Gospel of John.
Something like about being in the light. Those who do wicked deeds prefer the dark.
That's right. Those who do evil prefer the darkness. Yeah, it's in John's Gospel.
Yeah, they prefer the dark, and
that fits more appropriate for them.
Yeah. So anyway, tell me if I don't want to say everything in the book, because I would like people to buy the book and support you and your work. But would you mind giving us a rundown of what happened that afternoon, just in terms of the facts that we can gather from actual evidence? Like just a quick, what we know for sure based on the eyewitnesses that were actually there.
Well, the key witness that was there is a Benedictine priest named Celestine Say. And he unfortunately died in 2015. I never got to meet him. But he was in this, there was a cottage, and it was a 2-story cottage with 2 bedrooms upstairs and 2 downstairs. And when you entered the cottage, there was a foyer area, which was not just a hallway, but it was a pretty big kind of little room. There were some chairs and things in there. And as you entered the cottage, straight ahead of you, there was a stairway that went up to the 2nd floor. There was a shower. There was a doorway to a shower there. And then there was another door that was to a half bath, which was a toilet and sink. So.
Okay. And the 3 men who were staying in the cottage were Say and Thomas Merton.
On the 1st floor. As you entered the cottage, on your right-hand side was Father Merton's room. On the left-hand side was Father Say's room. And upstairs, there was a journalist named John Moffitt, who was the poetry editor for America Magazine, and he was above Merton. And then above Father Say was a very strange character named Francois De Grunne.
That was the craziest thing in your book. That guy was definitely sketchy, to say the least.
Everybody that's reading the book, even when they're halfway through, they said, "Tell me, was he the murderer?" He clearly had something to do with it. He's a very suspicious character. Yeah, he's a very suspicious character. But the day of the death, Moffitt, after lunch, went to he went sightseeing. But Father Say was in the lunchroom. Merton had just given a talk. They went to lunch. And after lunch, they shared a key to the cottage. And Say had the key, and Father Merton asked him if he could take the key, and he and De Grunne were going to walk back to the cottage. Mm-hmm. So this was, Moffitt was still sitting there at the time, and the key was transferred at 1:40. Moffitt and Say both agree on that. And the cottage is about 15 minutes away. So Father Merton and De Grunne left the lunchroom and headed for the cottage, and Say left shortly after. He was walking behind them, probably a couple of blocks behind. He could see them in the distance talking, he said. And they got to the cottage first, and Say was coming behind them. And they weren't walking real fast because it's very hot in Bangkok. Well, they were actually outside of Bangkok in a suburb. Mm-hmm. And when Say got to the cottage, the door was still unlocked, and he entered and went immediately to his room and took off his habit because it's warm, and he just hung it on a clothes rack, and he went to brush his teeth.
And I think it's important to note that when Say saw them walking ahead of him, that was really the last time anybody saw Thomas Merton alive.
Except for De Grunne.
And De Grunne would have been the last person to ever talk to him. Exactly. In that conversation, but we don't know what they said because no one ever asked De Grunne what they talked about. But
well, I think Moffitt said in a book that he wrote about the conference that De Grunne told him that Merton said something about we don't necessarily have to talk about Christ, we have to live as an example of Christ.
Oh wow,
something like that. But anyway, we don't really know that because whatever De Grunne says, I mean, you don't really know.
He wasn't very reliable. He was contradicting.
He changed his story a lot. Yeah. So whatever he says is really not reliable.
But Say, on the other hand, was always consistent in what he said. So he seems to be the most reliable witness.
Absolutely. And he was very troubled by the fact that Merton had died. And then he retold his story several times, and each time he retells it, it's exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And when he got to the cottage, he didn't see De Grunne or Merton. He figured they went to their rooms. He went to brush his teeth. Oh, and I didn't mention this, but in the layout of the cottage, there's that half bath in the foyer, and there's also a half bath in Merton's room.
Yeah.
But no shower.
No shower. That's important.
So anyway, Say arrives moments later, takes off his habit, brushes his teeth, and he hears De Grunne come downstairs. And De Grunne knocks on the door, and he said, "Are you okay?" And Say said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I thought I heard a shout." And he said, "No, I didn't shout." And he also said, "I thought you were Merton," which was kind of strange because he didn't know Say entered the cottage.
Right.
Well, he says, I thought you were Merton. But anyway, he goes back upstairs, and Merton's not making a sound. Say comes out of the bathroom after brushing his teeth, and he doesn't look in Merton's room. Now, the rooms, I need to tell you, there aren't any walls there. They just had screen, like you'd have on a window screen. And there were like some 2x4s that went floor to ceiling, and the screen closed off these rooms. Now, there were doors that had a latch that you could enter, but there wasn't a wall. So what they did is they hung some bed sheets for privacy.
Yeah. Okay.
But Father Say said you could look in the rooms if you wanted to peek in. It wasn't that private.
Yeah.
You could see. And when he left the bathroom, he glanced toward Merton's room. He noticed that the bed was empty, and he thought maybe Merton was sleeping on the floor because it was cooler, or maybe for penance. But he just didn't really pry. He thought that Merton was such a celebrity at this conference, he wanted to give him some privacy and some private time. So he left him alone and went to his room. But he couldn't sleep because De Grunne is upstairs pacing back and forth on the floor above him. And he's pacing and pacing. And he's opening his door, closing his door, opening his door, closing his door. And then about 3 o'clock, De Grunne comes down and leaves the cottage, but he's only gone for a few minutes. He comes right back in and bounces upstairs again, and then he continues to pace. And Say was going to take a nap, but he gave up on the nap, and he decided that he was going to take a shower and get ready because the conference was going to start again at 4:30. So he goes, takes a shower, comes out of the shower, goes back to his room, he starts to get dressed, and now around 3:30, De Grunne comes back down. And he hears him. You can hear everything in the cottage. And this is important because auditorially, Say is a witness not so much for what he sees, but for what he hears. And he never heard a sound from Merton's room.
The whole time, yeah.
And he said that when Merton was in his room moving around, he would hear his little bare feet pitter-patter on the floor. Mm-hmm. But he didn't hear anything.
And he could never fall asleep because he couldn't take a nap. So
De Grunne's pacing upstairs.
The only sound in the place is coming from De Grunne.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now De Grunne comes back down again at 3:30, and Say hears him come down those stairs, and he pauses. He knows that he's pausing by Merton's door because he stops walking, and then he continues on to Say's room, and he knocks on the door, and the first thing he says is, "Do you remember earlier when I told you I thought I heard a shout?" Say said, "Yes." He said, "Well," he said, "I think something's happened to Father Merton. Come and see." So Say comes out, and they look in the doorway, and they can see Merton's lying on the floor with the fan on top of him. De Grunne says, "I'll go get some help." And he leaves the scene. And Say, thinking Merton might just be unconscious or he doesn't know what's happened, he yells, "Father Merton, Father Merton." He's calling to him, trying to rouse him. He can't open the door because it's locked. And then De Grunne, meanwhile, goes outside the cottage and bumps into two abbots, Father Haas and a Father Egbert Donovan.
I want to ask real quick, what was the deal with the door being locked if there's just bed sheets? Why couldn't they just kind of pull the bed sheet aside and go in?
There's screen. There's window screen.
Oh, okay.
Floor to ceiling. And a door.
Oh, okay.
The door is latched.
So there's a floor to ceiling screen.
You can't enter the screen. Yeah, the screens, behind the screens are the bed sheets. Hanging.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, gotcha.
Just for like curtains. Well, when De Grunne approaches these two abbots, the first thing he says to them is, "Did you have a nice swim?" Because they'd been swimming. He didn't say anything about Merton being injured or anything. He just said, "Did you have a nice swim?" And later, these men recounted this, and they said this was a very strange thing to say under the circumstances when you go for help. And De Grunne also had another story that he was going to go get a key. Well, you don't really need a key to open the door. And that story was in the fake report, because we said I told you some reports were fake. And in the fake report, he said he was going to get a key, but that can't be true. And that's
he just sees these guys. He's like, "Oh, did you have a nice swim?" Like
right.
and then he's like, "Oh, by the way, somene's dead, or there's been an accident."
By the way, yeah, he's before he gets to that Merton's injured, he says, "Oh, earlier I heard a shout."
And he says it for the third time with the whole shout thing.
He told them he's had a shout, and he told them he heard a shout at 3:00, which is about an hour later than he first came down and told Say. So now he's changed his story. He said, "I heard a shout at 3:00," and then he said he came down later, which is like 3:30. Now it's past 3:30. He finds these two guys, and he has to tell them about the shout. He has to know about the swim. He has to know about the shout. And then he says, "Oh, by the way, I think something's happened to Father Merton. He's had an accident." So immediately when that's said, these two men run to the cottage, and they get there, and Say is at the door, and they see that it's locked. But they reached in. There's some louvered panels there, and they could reach in and undo the latch. And they entered, and immediately Father Donovan said, "Don't touch anything. He's already dead." He could see that he was dead. And they were all, I guess, they thought something was wrong. I think Father Haas went to move the fan at this point to lift it up, and he got a shock. So he recoiled. Mm-hmm. He didn't move the fan. He touched it and got a shock, and then Say pulled the plug and unplugged it. And then Donovan told Say, "I think you should bring your camera and take some photographs of this so we can show the police exactly how we found it."
Before the fan was moved, before anything was touched.
Yeah, they thought it looked suspicious.
So Thank God they did that, right? I mean,
this is very unusual because Crime scene photographs are normally taken by police.
Mm-hmm.
Citizens don't take pictures of crime scenes. They call the police. But these men thought they should take photographs to preserve the scene. And they did. And this was really remarkable that they did this because we have the photographs. Now, they disappeared for 50 years, but I found them up at the Columbia University in some papers.
So there were exactly 2 photographs that were taken of the undisturbed crime scene that disappeared. People knew about them, but no one allowed them to be published or even mentioned.
Well, they lied about them.
They
lied about them. They said that these pictures were taken after the scene was disturbed.
Right.
Which makes no sense. I mean, why would you need to take pictures of the scene after things have all been moved around and the police have been there? I mean, you don't need to preserve that evidence. But when the police did arrive, Father Say realized this was not a real investigation, so he didn't tell them about the photographs. He thought that they would probably confiscate his camera if they knew about them. So he kept quiet. And then when he got back to the Philippines and they were developed, one of them was underexposed, which means it was too dark. There wasn't enough light in the room. And the other one turned out. So he sent that photograph to the Abbot of Gethsemane and asked about Merton's autopsy because he thought there would certainly be an autopsy. And he thought that the abbot would want to see this photograph.
Right. So we can come back to the photographs later because that is so key that you went to Columbia University and actually looked at them and found them. Thank God. But Say had hidden the photographs from the Thai police because he didn't trust them. He knew something was fishy.
Well, yeah, because see, when they came with a doctor, not Vachara. He was a Thai doctor, like what we would call a coroner. They would come to declare someone dead.
Yeah.
And when he arrived, he just said, well, we're going to call this heart failure for convenience. And he told that to Father Say. So we're just going to call this heart failure for convenience because we don't want to have any complications.
Yeah.
So Say thought, well, that's not right. Doesn't look right. I mean, why is this fan on top of this person?
And he had been burned. His flesh was burned as well, right? Yeah. Like he had been electrocuted, but whether he was electrocuted before or after he was already dead is a question. We don't know.
We don't know. But there was also a bleeding head wound on the back of Merton's head that was seen by the witnesses. And the coroner and the police and the death certificate make no mention of any head wound. It's just they just ignored it. Well, you can't ignore this. I mean, you have to investigate what caused the head wound. Now, some people that argue that it was an accident say, well, he probably bumped his head on the floor when he fell, and that caused the head wound. Well, maybe, but let's investigate it and make sure that that's consistent with the evidence. Let's look at the head wound and see if it could have been caused by the floor or was it caused by an ice pick or a small caliber bullet or something else. I mean, a blunt instrument. I mean, what caused that head wound is a good question, and it has never been answered. So I spoke up at the Mary House in New York City last year in December, I think, and someone at the end asked a very good question. They said, well, I told them how Merton didn't die. They said, well, how did he die? And I said, well, we don't know.
Because there's no autopsy.
We don't really know how he died because there's never been an investigation of how Thomas Merton died. There just hasn't been an investigation. So I don't really know how he died, but I know that the story that he accidentally electrocuted himself in or a shower or took a shower and was wet, I mean, none of that is true. And Father Say, by the way, going back to the cottage when we were earlier, if Merton, to see this story about the shower, Say knows he didn't take a shower because he would have heard that. He heard everything else.
Yeah.
And he never heard Merton take a shower. And he also said that he thought when they did get in the room and saw the body that he said he might have been preparing to take a shower. But everyone said his body was dry. And
well, everybody at the crime scene, the original witness, said he had not taken a shower.
Right.
But everyone later who reported on it said he was wet from a shower.
Well, the shower story actually came in 1973, 5 years after Merton's death. The shower story emerged with Brother Patrick Hart.
Right.
He's the creator of the shower story. But the Um, the other thing that's not often said, because see, people have written so many things that are false. Michael Mott being one, the official biographer, who said that Merton emerged from the shower either naked or wearing his shorts. Well, no one wears his shorts in the shower, but Merton was found, in fact, wearing shorts. And some people have said that he was found naked, including Brother Patrick Hart. I have his picture right here. This guy, one of the monks at Gethsemane told me that Brother Patrick Hart told him that Merton had been found naked, and the people that found the body put the shorts on him to make him modest. And that is an absolute lie, because they took the photograph before anything was disturbed, and he's wearing shorts. So
Yeah.
the story of him being found naked has been told to push up the shower story, because people know if you touch your hair dryer or your toaster oven or your vacuum cleaner, you don't die. Now, sometimes if people are wet, well, maybe then you could be electrocuted. You know, if you're standing in water and electricity, it can be dangerous. So they added the water later, because it really is just not believable that someone is killed by a fan. I mean, it just doesn't happen.
Right. So the original witnesses were De Grunne, who originally saw. De Grunne was the last person to see him alive and talk to him. They entered the cottage together. And then he was the first person, well, he was the one who heard the shout that no one else heard. And then he was the first person to see Merton dead. And then aside from De Grunne, who was a monk from Belgium, there was Say, who had been in the cottage the whole time. And then there was the two monks that were on the road that had gone swimming who went and saw the body.
Right.
So really it's just those four people who saw it, right?
No, there were some others that came immediately after. See, when Say went to get his camera, Father Haas went to get Rembert Weekland, who was nearby in another cottage.
Okay.
So, and within a few minutes, Rembert Weekland and a nun came. Her name was Sister Eldertrude Weiss. She was a medical doctor and a nun, and she arrived and declared Merton dead. She moved the fan, and she looked into his pupils of his eyes and examined him. And she also saw that bleeding head wound. She noted that. And I think that there was some urine on the floor, because when you die, you can release urine. So that was things that she saw. But so she was a person who did see the scene. She drew a diagram, and she wrote a narrative of what she saw. But she wasn't the first one on the scene. But she was one of the early people there.
Okay, so then we have all these eyewitness reports of people who saw the scene before it was disturbed, and then we have the Thai police came and did like a phony. Let's just say it was cardiac arrest, so we don't make the lodge look bad for their faulty fan.
Well, you know, I've been thinking about that. I'm glad you said that, because that's the way Mott portrayed it, and that's the way De Grunne portrayed it, that they did this because they didn't want to embarrass their Thai hosts. But really, it doesn't make sense that the police would cover up for the retreat center. I mean, the retreat center has. I mean, they're saying there's a cover up. Okay, there's a cover up here. We're admitting that it's a cover up, but to believe that they covered up for the retreat center doesn't make sense. Now, maybe you could say that they were covering up for the Hitachi fan company, because it was a Hitachi fan, which is a Japanese product of high quality. And you could say, well, they didn't want Hitachi to be sued, but that's pretty unbelievable too, because Hitachi didn't even know that their fan killed anybody, so they wouldn't be bribing the Thai police. So who are the Thai police covering up for? You know, what's amazed me is that right out of the gate, that the monastery didn't want to sue the Red Cross Retreat Center and the fan company, because the Abbey said from the very beginning that this was an accident. Well, somebody's liable for that. And Merton was a moneymaker for the Abbey. He produced a lot of books that produced a lot of income, and now he's dead. Well, somebody should have to pay for that. Furthermore, you don't want other people to be killed by these fans at a careless retreat center, so they need to be sued in order to protect the public so other people aren't killed. But the Abbey never sued anybody. And you wonder, well, why didn't they do that? Well, I think maybe some lawyers may have contacted them and asked them, why don't you sue? And I think that's when the shower story came along, because they said, well, it was really Merton's fault. he was wet. So,
Yeah.
Sue, because Merton did it. And Merton has been called a klutz by his own Abbey. People say, oh, Merton was such a klutz. Yeah, he did it. They blame him. They blame the victim here. But see, he did not. That's why I think that shower story came about. But there was a cover up. I mean, clearly everybody that was there knew. And the people, the nun, Dr. Weiss, she was puzzled by that fan being on Merton. She said, how did this fan get here? Why is this here? Everyone wondered, why is the fan on top of Merton? And in the police report, they wrote that the dead priest collided with the fan and fell. Well, if he's already dead before he comes in contact with the fan didn't kill him. They're saying the heart failure killed him.
Yeah.
Well, then we wrote in the book, and I think this is a good analogy. If you get a heart attack or heart failure, and you are next to a fan that happens to have a faulty cord installed inside of it, so that you get electrocuted and have a cardiac arrest at the same time, we said it's like stepping on a venomous snake when you're struck by lightning. I mean, what are the odds of this?
Yeah. The story is.
And then I add one more thing to that. There's on top of that, and I couldn't put the photographs in the book because the Abbey wouldn't let me. In fact, I didn't want to publish the pictures, but I had a Supreme Court artist here in Washington, D.C. that draws pictures for the court draw drawings of these photographs because I wanted to put them in the book so people could see how the body was actually found. And Merton's body is lying flat on his back with his arms at his side. And he's perfectly straight. Now, if you've ever been around someone that falls, either by tripping or if they have an elderly person who takes a tumble, they don't fall straight on their back. They usually fall in a heap. Their knees buckle and they go down, or they throw their arms out to try to break their fall, but you don't fall backwards with your arms at your side. You instinctively throw your arms out to break your fall. And on top of that, there was a clothes rack in the corner there where his head was in a corner, sort of at a 45-degree angle. And there's this clothes rack with these little wooden dowels, where you'd hang clothes and things to dry. The bottom dowel is over his left shoulder. So his shoulder is under the clothes rack. You can see it in the picture.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's one thing to fall on the floor, but then after you're dead and you fall on the floor, your dead body slides over to get underneath the clothes rack.
And that's why they took the picture, because they saw something's up here, like what happened to him, like, and what you do in the book that you guys, you need to get the book, because it sounds like we're talking about a lot of crazy details, but it's not that complicated. This book it's 280 pages long, and it's very simple. Here's the evidence of what we have from eyewitnesses and police reports. And here's what's reported. And what was reported is simply just not the facts that we had. Some facts are left out. The fact that there was no autopsy done, that's a problem when there's a dead body that died in such a bizarre circumstance. But then in the reporting, Hugh tells us that they don't mention that there wasn't an autopsy done. Like, that's just kind of not talked about. So people assume that there was an autopsy done and it was inconclusive, but there was never one done. And that whole thing is really weird in itself, that the monastery, frankly, wouldn't have wanted to have an investigation.
Well, the longer I've looked at this, and after the book came out, the reaction of the monastery is not good. In fact, I went down there last year in March. I wrote a letter ahead of time and asked if I could come and visit, and I wanted to get an appointment to meet with some of the monks, and they didn't respond to me. But I drove down anyway. And when I arrived, they told me that I shouldn't have come there and that I was not welcome.
Like you point out in the book, normally when the victims of 9/11, their families have rallied to try to find the truth. when somebody that you love dies, you want to know the truth about what happened. And it does seem as if they don't care. Like they don't want to know the truth. They just want to go with the story that he was electrocuted by a fan, either in the shower, in the bath, after he got out of the bath, was wearing shorts, was not wearing shorts, was electrocuted before he was dead or after he died. Maybe he had a heart attack, maybe he didn't. They're okay with all of this lack of clarity.
Let's go back to the beginning again. I told you we have to start at the beginning.
Yeah.
See, we know the origin of the shower story is Brother Patrick Hart, and that was published in the Asian Journal of Thomas Merton. And he made up that story. In fact, I called Brother Patrick and I wrote to him, and he left me a voicemail message and said that because I asked him, what evidence do you have that Merton took a shower?
I'm sorry, real quick, is he passed away now, or is he still alive?
He died last February at the age of 93.
Oh, he did. Okay, so you did have a chance to try to get. So you did have a chance to talk to him and.
Talked to him, but he called me and left a voice message because I wrote to him and I asked him to tell me what evidence does he have that Merton took a shower. And he said on the voice message that there's actually no evidence that Merton took a shower. He admitted this.
Okay, so he admitted that.
But he said
we don't know why he made that up.
It's very hot in Bangkok, so he undoubtedly took a shower.
He assumed it. He assumed it.
But there's no evidence.
And there's no evidence, and the eyewitness reports contradict that.
Exactly. Now, a couple of things I want to touch on that you've mentioned. One is the autopsy. The other one is the accident. What we know the origin of the shower story is Brother Patrick. Since the book's been published, I've been re-examining what is the origin of the accident story. It's a good question. Where did that story come from?
That it was an accident.
That it was an accident. And the origin of the accident story is not from Thailand. The Thais published in their newspapers the following day that this was a cardiac failure, heart failure. And that's their story. That's what's in their reports. So where do we get the accident? Well, we have Brother Patrick saying that they learned that from the American Embassy. But I don't think so, because we have the American Embassy report and it says sudden heart failure. They didn't say accident in their report. Neither does the death certificate or the doctor's certificate. So we have Brother Patrick, who's already made up the shower story, telling us that the embassy told him it was an accident. Well, when we wrote our book, we thought maybe the embassy did tell him that because, it's the government and maybe you can't trust them. But, the more I've meditated and thought about this, the origin of the accident story is the Abbey of Gethsemane. Mm. And at their website today, they still have Brother Patrick's narrative that says that Merton died of accidental electrocution. They're sticking with that story. There is nothing, no evidence, nothing to support accidental electrocution. They don't have any evidence of that. All they have is Brother Patrick said the embassy told them. Well, I don't believe that anymore. The accident story originated in Kentucky, not in Thailand. And the people in Kentucky are sticking with their story. That's disturbing.
It's interesting that you found the photographs that were taken, and they do show that Thomas Merton, they disprove a lot of what's out there. Like his hands were contorted from the electricity. They weren't. And that's in the photograph. He's wearing shorts. His body is laying on his back. There's a lot of things that the photographs could bring to light, but the Abbey has not allowed you to publish them, correct?
Right. Now, the other thing that's very disturbing about this Abbey, if you will, and I'm just going to call them out the way it is. There's a letter that came out from the Abbey. It was a cover letter that they received when they received the documents, because they received the death certificate, they received the doctor's certificate, they received the embassy report, and they have a cover letter that said that all of those things were sent to them. This is the cover letter that they received, and it said, we're enclosing all these documents. Well, where are the documents? The Abbey says they don't have them. I contacted them and asked them if they have the death certificate. They said, well, we don't know where it is. We don't have it. Well, I did find it because Rembert Weekland brought these documents back from Thailand when he came back in '68 and held them for all these years. And when I contacted him and asked him about Merton's death, he said, I have some documents. I'll mail them to you. And on yellowed paper, they arrived. I was surprised to get them from him. I asked him if he'd like them back. He said, no, I've had them in long enough. He said, you can have them. Well, I sent them to the Merton Center because they'd never seen them before. So now they're down at Bellarmine University. But I also went to the National Archives and I obtained the same documents with some differences. One of the differences was on the doctor's certificate, it says that an autopsy had been performed at the hospital. That's also on the death certificate. But on the back, not the back, but on the front of this document, the translated copy, there's a note from an embassy official that says, no, this is not part of the translation, but there was no autopsy performed. This document says an autopsy is performed, but that's not true. So you've got a contradictory document officially by one official saying an autopsy is performed and another official writing on the same document that there was no autopsy performed. And indeed, there was no autopsy performed. But this is another reason why we should trust the embassy, because the embassy let us know by writing on this translated copy that there was no autopsy. They're being truthful. Mm-hmm. So the Abbey gets these documents, they lose them, but they talk about them. And Brother Patrick, he wrote this in the Asian Journal in his account there. And also I know he did an interview with a German scholar. And Brother Patrick would refer to these documents. And he'd say, oh, I've looked at the official records. I've seen the medical reports, the doctor's report, and the death certificate. It was an accident. Well, wait a minute. None of those documents say accident.
Right.
He likes to invoke them. He likes to tell you what the documents say. He would like to say, we have these documents, and they confirm that this was accidental electrocution. Well, he's not telling us the truth because, we have now, they held those documents and kept them secret. Now we have them. We can see that they don't say accidental electrocution. And they've been telling us that for 50 years without ever producing the documents. People just trusted them. And thought, well, the monks said that they'd have the documents, and the monks said the death certificate confirms accident. Well,
if they're satisfied with it, why shouldn't we be? Yeah.
Well, how dare you question those monks? And actually, the International Thomas Merton Society is pretty unhappy with my co-author and I because we challenged the veracity of Brother Patrick Hart. And they said, well, you can't do that. He's such a nice guy. Well, all of us are capable of sin, and some serious sins. You, me, everybody. We're human beings. And Brother Patrick and monks at a monastery are no different than the rest of us. People like to think that they're holier because they pray several times a day, and some of them may well be holy men, but some of them can also be sinners. It's just the way we are as human beings. But people are just afraid to question the Gethsemane monks and the Brother Patrick Hart. They just won't do it. And here in Washington, D.C., maybe you've heard of our former Archbishop Cardinal Theodore McCarrick.
Oh, yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. He's a big scandal figure now, but for years, how dare you say anything about Cardinal McCarrick,
Yeah.
Penn State, they'd say, how dare you say anything about Jerry Sandusky? He has a heart of gold. He loves these children. Well, I'm sorry, but, sometimes people do evil things. And on
that note, it could have been, we don't really know. It could have been that he was straight up lying and covering up. It could have been that he was, like a lot of people do, they try to protect the reputation of the church. They don't want to cause scandal, so they think that their lies are serving some better purpose or something. Or, like you point out in the book, a lot of times
do what they do, but we know. I don't know why Brother Patrick did what he did, but we know that he didn't tell us the truth. That's a fact.
And that he
and he knew he wasn't going to.
And he kind of knew he had everything at his disposal. So it could be that he didn't look at it or read it very well. No. Just to be charitable, maybe he didn't really look at it and go, oh, the photographs show him dry and wearing shorts and we're telling everyone he was in the bath. I don't know. Maybe he just didn't look into the evidence
Well, he did, though. He did, because he sent a draft of his narrative for the Asian Journal. He sent it to John Moffitt, who was living in the cottage above Merton's room. He was there, and Moffitt wrote to Father Say. He tried to get information from De Grunne, and he was sent by Brother Patrick a draft, and I found it in Moffitt's papers at the University of Virginia. There's a draft from Brother Patrick saying, "Here's what I'm going to write for the Asian Journal. What do you think?" And Moffitt said, "I think you should tell the truth. You shouldn't write things that are not true." He said, "You can't say he took a shower. Why don't you say he may have taken a shower? But don't say he took a shower." Moffitt was trying to get him to phrase it a little bit so it might not be exactly a lie, but maybe you could just lean in a certain direction. But, Brother Patrick didn't listen to Moffitt. Now, Moffitt told him, "Don't say he died at 3 o'clock because we know that's not true." So Brother Patrick changed that on Moffitt's advice to say that he died not at 3 o'clock. But, Brother Patrick knew that Moffitt had interviewed people and written to people, and he knew, because he was there, what the facts were. So Brother Patrick ran his story by Moffitt. Moffitt said, "Don't say these things that are not true." And Brother Patrick did it anyway. So we can't say he didn't know. Moffitt told him, "What you're writing isn't true."
Yeah.
And don't call it an accident. Moffitt said, "I don't know that it was an accident. I wouldn't call it." He said, I wouldn't call it an accident. And I'm sort of with Moffitt because I don't know how Thomas Merton died. And when we buy into the story that it was an accident, we're being deceived.
Yeah. Well, we don't know how he died, but you do point out in the book so many things that are never brought up, inconvenient details, things that are fishy. One of the weird, so I think the lack of an autopsy is the number one red flag. I think the photographic evidence that's been suppressed is another key detail. The third thing that just made my jaw drop when I read it is that this De Grunne character, the last person to see him alive, the first person to see him dead, who was so weird, and everyone there was like, he's creepy, he's strange, he's nervous, he has strange behaviors, disappears off the face of the earth, and no one ever sees him or hears from him again. How in this day and age can you not track somebody down on Google or figure out where they're living? Tell me, did you try to find him?
Oh, everyone asks me this question.
It's the weirdest
thing. I remember Father Say wrote in a letter that he said, "De Grunne gave me the creeps." It's his words. And he was creepy, but I did my best to try to find him. I think the only thing I could find was that he had died he has died at I don't know if it was 2005 or something, because see, the Benedictines keep a register of all the Benedictines that are in the order, and 1 year he's on the list, the next year he's gone. That means he has passed on, so he had died. So we know he's no longer living. But I did find his abbey in Belgium where he lived, and I wrote to them, and then I had some Benedictines that I knew that were monks that actually spoke French and could communicate to contact them, and they don't respond. They won't say anything. And then one of the Benedictine monks told me, he put it this way. He said, "There are people in our own community that we'd rather the public not know about." I guess all of us too, to be fair, have members of our family that are maybe a little embarrassing to our family because of their behaviors. Mm-hmm. And I think that De Grunne may have been one of these monks that they'd just rather not talk about.
Yeah.
And I can understand that, but unfortunately, I don't know where he came from. I was curious about what he did before he entered the Benedictine community, what he did while he was a Benedict. I'd like to know everything I could about him, but there's really nothing to know.
It seems like in any crime scene, he would be your number one suspect.
Oh, certainly, he would have to be a suspect because he couldn't keep his story straight. In fact, Father Say said that he and the nun, Sister Eldertrude Weiss, and De Grunne were pulled aside by the police. They wanted to talk to them, and they talked to Say. And while they were talking to Say, he said De Grunne was fidgeting the whole time, and he was nervous. And when the police told him they wanted him to stick around so they could ask him more questions, he said that De Grunne blew his top. and he acted very suspicious. Well, he's suspicious. In fact, another thing is, I told you how he was pacing back and forth. Uh, I think it was John Moffitt that wrote that even the day before Merton died, De Grunne was pacing that day too. He was nervous, and if he knows that a crime is coming, he'd already be nervous.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that based on what we know, it appears that Say was supposed to discover the body. And De Grunne is upstairs waiting for Say to find the body. But Say never knocks on the door or calls to Merton, or he doesn't want to bother him.
Wasn't that it seems like if you heard a shout, you might go like look around the house and find out. But he comes to Say and goes, nudge, nudge, didn't you hear something? You know, like, aren't you going to go check it out? Like, and then, yeah, maybe he was waiting for Say to do that.
I think he was waiting for Say to find Merton, because he didn't want to find the body. He wanted Say to find the body. And that's why I think he came down at 3 o'clock and went out of the cottage and came back in, because he's keeping busy, you know, like, and disturbing Say, so Say can't sleep, and waiting for him to find. And when Say wouldn't find the body, De Grunne finally came down and said, I think you better go check on him, you know. I mean, why don't you go look, duh, you know, and I'm going to leave and go get help, see.
Yeah.
So he takes off. But yeah, that's what I think Say was supposed to find the body, but he wouldn't do it. I don't think De Grunne is the killer, though. I think he's too nervous.
Yeah.
He's just too nervous. He doesn't have the nerve for it. But I think he was supposed to bring Father Merton to the cottage, you know. And I think he was killed rather quickly upon entering, because Say arrived moments later, and I think the deed had already been done.
I think so too. Yeah.
He may have seen the killer, but because his story changes so much, I think he was a player in some respect, but probably he may have actually become the patsy if they needed one. They may have arrested him in Thailand, and he may have ended up like Jeffrey Epstein or somebody. But if they didn't get away with it being a secret assassination, which they did get away with, I think that De Grunne may have had to be the fall guy. He was lucky he didn't get himself in more trouble than he was.
Yeah, and you point out in the book that a lot of people don't aid and abet the CIA because they're evil people and they want to help an evil organization, but the CIA will have something on them. And hey, if you don't do this, we're going to expose X, Y, or Z. You know, they use blackmail all the time. So we don't know what they had on who and how they might have held that over people's heads to make them brush things under the rug. You point out that there was a journalist from American Magazine there who was staying in the cottage, and he stayed there for 4 days after Thomas Merton had died, and never interviewed people, put together did a story on it. Never showed any interest in reporting on this significant event, the most significant thing he could have possibly reported on at that retreat. Is that guy still alive, that journalist?
No, Moffitt's gone. But his papers are at the University of Virginia.
I just think it's weird that he was there to report on the conference, but never wrote anything about the murder of Thomas Merton or the death of Thomas Merton, right? I mean, that's
strange. Yes, it is strange.
Odd.
He saved all these letters, you know. He was good at saving stuff that helped us find things, but he didn't want to. I think he wrote a letter to the Abbey of Gethsemane once and said that I don't want to write something that's not true, but at the same time he said I don't want to write anything that you don't want me to. So I want to be a good servant to you, but I don't want to write things that aren't true. So he was trying to play a difficult role. I'm just trying. He didn't want to outright lie, but then he wouldn't report things that he did know. He knew things that he didn't tell people about, and in that way, it's kind of a lie of omission to not tell what you know.
Yeah.
Just kept quiet. because he knew the Abbey. Like, I think he wrote about the photographs once, and he wrote to John Howard Griffin in a letter, and he said, "I have seen the never to be shown photograph."
Never to be shown, right?
Yeah, Say sent him a copy of the photograph. And
so if it was just an accident, why can't it be shown? I mean,
well, because it's not an accident, and they don't want you to look at it because it doesn't look right. It looks suspicious. And I mean, I would have loved to have published drawings of the photographs. You can, if anyone is listening to this, they want to see the photographs. They are at Columbia University at the Butler Library in the Rare Book and Manuscript Room in the papers of John Howard Griffin, who wrote the book Black Like Me. And that's where they are. And they're also, copies of the photographs are at Gethsemane, I'm not Gethsemane, at Bellarmine University Center. Now, they actually had one of the photographs at the Thomas Merton Center for many years, but nobody paid any attention to it because John, or Michael Mott rather, wrote that the photo was taken after the scene was disturbed. So everybody looked at it, so well, that was after the scene was disturbed.
Yeah.
And nobody thought it was of any value because what difference does it make how after the scene is disturbed? But when we uncovered that these photographs were taken, and Say was very clear in several letters saying, "I took these photographs before anything was disturbed."
Yeah.
This is exactly how we found the body. So now the photographs have a lot more value because we know that they are the actual photos of the scene before it was disturbed. And if you go to Kentucky or you're near New York City, you can.
Yeah.
That's where the Abbey of Gethsemane, the Abbot Dietz told me that if people want to see the photographs, they can do what I did and they can go to the library and look at them. And he said, "I'm not going to give you permission to publish even drawings."
Yeah. Another thing that, I mean, the book is so good at exposing the way the media is complicit in suppressing the truth. And you point out in the book that includes the Catholic media as well, Catholic news agency. And the way these things are, the way that they create fake opposition. And they'll say, oh, there were these skeptics and conspiracy theorists who thought it was a murder, but that's been debunked. And so they purposely give it some attention for a moment, and then they debunk it in their fake way. And then so anybody who looks into it will go, oh, that was already debunked. That was, but unless you go back to the eyewitness evidence, the photograph, and all the police reports as you did, I mean, you cannot rely on the Catholic media or the secular media to tell us the truth. That's the only way. We have to depend on people like you guys who are going to actually go do the research.
Well, all of us have a responsibility, really. I mean, when something doesn't look right, it probably isn't. And if something doesn't look right, we ought to question it and look into it. And that's what made me look into the Foster case. It just didn't make sense to me for the first day when they said that an anonymous person found the body. I said, it can't be anonymous. That's a witness.
Yeah.
You have to know who that is.
And you noticed the same thing in this investigation. Names were misspelled in the police reports, probably to throw people off.
You can't find the witnesses when their names are all misspelled. This is a technique that we saw in the Foster case. My friend Patrick Knowlton, whose name is spelled Knowlton. Good name to Google, Patrick Knowlton. Wow. And FBI. Yeah, he's a very interesting man. Probably the most interesting person I've ever met, really. A wonderful guy. And Patrick, his name was spelled Knowlton. No K, no W. And even the FBI had misspelled it so many times in their own reports, they couldn't find him. When they wanted to find him, they didn't know how to spell his name.
So that's like a thing they do. That's like
his name on it. It was hard to find him.
And then the other thing they do is when they wrote about it, they'd be like the priest, the abbot, the doctor. They wouldn't use names in a lot of this stuff.
That's true. That Brother Patrick did that. When he would write up the story, he would never tell anybody's name. See, you can't find the witnesses to talk to them because they're hidden from you.
Yeah.
The techniques are used across the board in any cover-up. It's the same type of procedures. And it's not a lot of people. A lot of people make a mistake. They think a lot of people have to be involved in a cover-up. They think, well, too many people would have to be in on it. Someone would tell us the truth. And that's not true. Most people just, it's something you said earlier, they just go along to do their job. I mean, to be a good soldier, carry out the orders, and they don't question. So you don't need all the FBI agents or all of the people to be participants. They just, like Moffitt was telling the abbot, Flavian Burns, he said, I just want to be a good soldier. I don't want to write anything that you don't want me to write. I just want to do my duty, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to write anything false. So
I don't want to get on anyone's bad side, because I want to continue to, be given assignments and access to things and all that.
See, the abbot, Flavian Burns, fed Moffitt some false information. He told him that there were no fuses in the cottage, that Merton may have taken a bath, and see, Moffitt knew these things were not true.
Mm-hmm.
And the abbot Flavian's trying to say, well, this is my guess, this is what I think happened, and then he would feed him this misinformation. Well, Moffitt knew those things were not true. So he wrote back to him and said, look, I don't want to write things that aren't true, but I don't want to get on your bad side. I don't want to do anything that wouldn't make you happy, see. So people just go along to get along. Of course, the best example is, as I mentioned earlier when we started, was Brett Kavanaugh, who got along with everybody and did his duty as a good soldier, and now he's a justice on the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
That he went right up the ladder because he did his duty. So.
Yeah, I don't know much about his background, but that's interesting.
He's a very spineless man. He's a very weak man. He's not his own man. He's just a good soldier. He does his duty.
And you could say that about the press too. I want to read aloud this. Can I read a paragraph from your book?
Sure.
You write, the Catholic press, it would appear, does not offer alternative news, but rather serves to complement the secular official media. The Catholic news media, including the popular EWTN, does not question the official narratives of important events like 9/11 or the assassinations of JFK, RFK, MLK, and Thomas Merton. They even idly stood by when in 2005, syndicated columnist George Will, through the Washington Post and other newspapers, spread British writer Simon Winchester's completely unfounded slander of the church that after the massive 1755 earthquake in Lisbon, priests, quote, roamed the streets of Lisbon having people hanged as heretics, out of suspicion that they were responsible for the tragedy. Catholic news, unfortunately, looks very little different from the New York Times, Associated Press, Fox, PBS at their most propagandistic, with the added window dressing of some Vatican news to make what they are dishing out more digestible. So how has your book been received by the secular media and the Catholic media? Is anybody reviewing it, talking about it, or are they just dismissing it outright?
No, I think, I don't know. There's a journalist named Patricia Lefevre, who's a pretty well-known Catholic writer. She's been for decades, and she wrote about our book.
Okay.
For the National Catholic Reporter.
Oh, okay. But, the Reporter, okay. I could see them publishing something on it.
They wouldn't publish it.
Oh, they wouldn't?
No, but I got a copy of it. It's at our website, the Martyrdom of ThomasMerton.com. You can find Lefevre's article there. In fact, I think it's also at the Thomas Merton Center. If you go to the Thomas Merton Center website,
mm-hmm.
Her name Lefevre, it's spelled I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's Lefevere. And she did write an article, but it was canned by the editors. It was censored.
Okay, so what about National Catholic Register?
Someone wrote something, but it just didn't get out.
Okay.
Didn't get published. Now, I mean, the Catholic Worker gave us a good review, but they're really not part of the Catholic organization. They just have the name Catholic Worker, but they're not a Catholic publication. Culture Wars with E. Michael Jones gave us a nice review.
Oh, did they?
Yes, but they're not an authorized. I mean, they're not part of the church.
Right.
But they're Catholic. So, and also probably the most supportive journalist of all is this man Patrick Jameson on the West Coast. He's in Victoria, British Columbia. he has a publication called Island Catholic News.
Okay.
Put in Island Catholic News in our book title or my name or something in the articles. He's been just relentless in promoting our book.
Good. Okay.
He's really been a strong supporter. And there are secular publications like the Irish American News in Chicago gave us a nice review. Edward Curtin was one of the first out of the gate with a really nice review on the internet, and he learned about our book from James Douglas.
Okay.
I'm curious, how did you find out about this book? But that helped us a lot. Now there are we've only had one bad review, and that was from the International Thomas Merton Society. In their publication, it's called the Merton Seasonal, and this was their edition on the 50th anniversary of Merton's death. It has the marker of his grave, and there's a book review in there that slammed the book, and they really don't like us. The International Thomas Merton Society has rallied around Brother Patrick Hart, and that's why they put his picture on the cover of their edition last summer. And I'll read you a quote in here in the back. This is from Mary R. Somerville. She took some people to Gethsemane Abbey, and Brother Patrick gave them a tour. After the tour, they took some questions, and it says the savvy questioner asked, quote, "Did the CIA kill Merton?" End quote. Brother Patrick responded, quote, "Merton was always a klutz. He was never to be trusted with machinery. He was accident prone. His death was just that, an accident." Now, this is long after our book has been out, and they're still putting out this stuff, and they're putting his picture on the cover, and the whole edition, this is after he died, it's all eulogizing the guy, what a great guy he was. I'm sure he's a very charming fellow. And it reminded me of a quote from Groucho Marx, who said, "Integrity is everything. And when you can fake integrity, you got it made." I think that describes Brother Patrick Hart. I mean, everybody loved the guy, and he's a very charming fellow. He just didn't tell the truth.
Well, it's hard to imagine that this can be out here because it is well researched, it's well written, and even though to those of you guys, if you're still listening to this podcast, it sounds very complicated. It's not. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's very clear that people were reporting things that weren't true and spreading lies, and lies of omission as well, leaving out very important details that would make you question it if you weren't already questioning it. And that there's just no excuse for that. There's no way to. So I guess all people can do is ignore this, pretend
that's what the International Thomas Merton Society has been doing. They just ignore, and they wish we would go away. My co-author, David Martin, wrote an excellent article that was published in the Island Catholic News in the last edition in December, called "An Enemy of the Thomas Merton Society," and it's about us. He draws an analogy with the famous play by Henrik Ibsen called "An Enemy of the People," which I think was where they got the idea for the movie Jaws, which I didn't see. But see that in the story, there's a doctor in his town who discovered that the water was polluted in the city, and it was polluted from the tannery up the river, which was a big part of the economy, and it polluted these baths where people would come for health reasons, for spas, but the people were dying. And the doctor thought, well, I made this great discovery, the water's polluted. And he thought everyone would welcome this news, But of course, the town was ready to crucify him because it was going to ruin their economy. It was going to ruin the tannery business. It was going to ruin the tourist business. It was just shut up, So we don't want you to tell anybody. And by the end of the play, he's the enemy of the people. And he thought he was going to be welcomed. And my co-author and I really thought that the International Thomas Merton Society, with all of these Merton admirers, would be very interested in learning how the man that they admire so much had died. And I was quite surprised by their reaction. Even the Abbey, they really, when I told you when I went there, they said, "You shouldn't have come here. You're not welcome here."
Wow.
And
that's sad.
Well, we can pray for them. I mean, it was a surprise. It's not the reaction I thought I would get from those people, because there's 45 chapters of the International Thomas Merton Society just in the United States. There's a lot of people that are interested in Merton, but one of them, Greg Hillis, the professor at Bellarmine University, wrote a thing on Twitter and told his followers, "Don't read this book."
What? Oh my gosh.
Don't read this book.
I'm telling people, read this book. I mean, it's coming from me. I'm not the president of any chapter of anything, but
I just thought people would want to know. I mean, especially the Merton people. But they're not. We've submitted articles for their publication, their journal, and we submitted a paper to speak at their conference, and everything we submitted has been declined, and they've just called us conspiracy nuts, and they say that we're mean, that we're not nice, and I don't know.
Oh, I think you're pretty nice.
The truth is, I got pretty upset, I'm afraid.
I mean, it's too bad Brother Patrick can't be alive to I guess, defend himself or whatever. But it's all very, very fishy. And I like I said at the beginning of the podcast, it's just a microcosm of something much bigger that's going on. And you just do a good job of pointing out their tactics of truth suppression, their ways of covering things up. And because you can notice these patterns, like you can apply it to this case and go, oh, we've seen this before. This is what they do. And I think that's really important to educate people about so that they can understand the way that truth is suppressed. Because we kind of, I'll link to the article, The 17 Techniques of Truth Suppression.
Yes.
It's really good. I mean, we should all be aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah, the techniques of truth suppression. It's the same thing with magic. I'm a professional magician, and I lie. I mean, I gave a lecture to the local. I gave a group to the local magic club last week, and I was showing them a trick that I do. And when I finished, I was going to explain it to them. I said, this is all done with a series of lies, lie upon lie upon lie. And you get people to believe something that's false, and that's the premise. And then people will use their own good deductive reasoning to reason from the false premise to their conclusion. But they started with the false premise. And once you get them to believe something false, they do the rest of the reasoning themselves. And they're very confident in their conclusion because they, well, I've reasoned this out. I've thought this through. And they have indeed. But I've gotten them to start from the wrong point.
And I'd be more than open to, I mean, I'd love for someone to come along and write about this book and address what's here and explain why it's an accident, given what you're telling us here. But I have a feeling nobody's going to do that. They're just going to ignore it and brush it under the rug because there's really no way they can explain why did they say he was in the bath when there was absolutely no evidence of that and there was evidence to the contrary. So it's like I'd be open to hearing anybody who could take issue with what's written here. I suspect nobody will attempt to do that in a straightforward way.
Well, that's why I think the Thomas Merton Society is so silent. One of my Benedictine monk told me that the book was unassailable. That was his description of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that the Thomas Merton Society they just don't have a answer for the book except to call it conspiracy theory. You throw a name at it.
Yeah, the old conspiracy theory epithet. I thought maybe we could end with a couple of poems by David Martin. Would that be okay?
Oh, sure.
This one, they're just real short and sweet. Thomas Merton's Destiny. He lived to a higher standard, so it should be no surprise that his unexpected death was met by the standard lies. And this one's called Wise Monkeys. Why haven't they looked into Merton's demise? Here's what's occurred to me. Our scholars have all averted their eyes out of fear of what they might see. Very simple, but it kind of gets to the point, I think.
Yeah, and the last one that's on the back cover of the book, I was when I was like David wrote a long time ago, called Idling Intellect. It says, whenever conspiracy theory I hear, I know that a brain has just gone out of gear. The common phenomenon again I behold of a person determined to believe what he's told by the press and the political powers that be who've long had no credibility. It's a sad thing to witness the widespread condition of critical faculties out of commission, and a once proud people now cowed into submission.
Yeah, that's where we are.
That's the response to the conspiracy theory charge.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Well, thanks again, Hugh. It's been a real delight to meet you.
Thank you.
And thanks for all of your work with this investigation. And there's a quote I like by Edith Stein, Teresa Benedict of the Cross. She said, anybody pursuing truth is pursuing God, whether or not they know it.
That's I concur with that, absolutely. Yeah, that's been my path. It's been a joy to find things. It's sort of when I would find a document or find the photographs, to me it's like opening up an oyster and there's a pearl in there or something. It is fun to look for the truth, because you will find it if you seek it about anything. And whether you're looking at the stars or a flower, it's the beauty that's there is really something to see, and it's worth investigating. And almost anything you can get to, you'll find God if you search long enough. So thank you for having me on your program. As the great comic Steve Allen once said, it was nice being had.
Well, thank you for being here and for writing the book. And here it is one more time, you guys, The Martyrdom of Thomas Merton. Read it to learn more about his death and the way our society and our media operates in this world today. You'll learn a lot. Thanks, Hugh. Keep up the good work. And all right, take care. Bye.